Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I'll open our first session of the afternoon. The theme of this session is learning from success. And what we'd like to do during this theme is to highlight 3 examples of very sort of bright lights or promising practices, places where we think this concept of real-world evidence has at least started to break forth. But what we've asked our speakers to do is to not spend a lot of time on the sort of history of what worked, but to challenge them to say, this good thing that we have done, how could it scale and spread? So what we will hear about are 3 examples. The Salford lung study, which is an example of taking the real-world evidence generating process in the pre-approval phase, and really sort of as I see it, one of the first shining examples of that. And what we hope to hear about is how could that spread to other locations, other clinical areas. We'll hear about the Sentinel program, which has become sort of the national model for studying the safety of marketed drugs. And I hope that we'll hear also some about how could this model be expanded to answer questions about efficacy or effectiveness or eventually even the value of treatments. We'll also hear about NEST, the new national effort to develop a data infrastructure regarding medical devices, especially along the lines of, are devices really different from drugs? Are there things we can learn from that experience that could be applied to real-world evidence about newly marketed drugs? Our speakers, speaking about the Salford lung study, will be Martin Gibson and Marie Kane. Martin is the Chief Executive Officer and Marie is the Chief Operating Officer of Northwest EHealth. Next, we will hear from Rich Platt, who's Professor and Chair of the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard. And about NEST, we'll hear from Rachel Florence. Our speakers will come up and go back down in the audience so we don't distract you. And then when we're done, we'll come up here and I'll introduce our 2 discussants as well. But we'll start off hearing about Northwest EHealth.
Thanks very much, Greg, and thank you very much for inviting us. So Northwest EHealth is the organisation that was set up back in 2008. It's based in Manchester in the UK. And you might only ever get that picture. There we go. So we're going to talk about how we might generalise and scale the Salford lung studies. And the Salford lung studies were performed rather confusingly, not just in Salford, as we'll come to, and there were 2 of them, so it's not just the Salford lung study. There was one in COPD and one in asthma, and they were both sponsored, as you almost certainly know, by GSK. So just to cut to the chase, there were 2 studies. Between them, there were over 7,200 patients. These patients were monitored in pretty close to real time for safety outcomes using a citywide linked electronic health record system. We believe it's the first study in the world to evaluate the effectiveness of pre-licensed medicine in this way. And we were able to show both for asthma and COPD that this generated results, and they're published if you wish to look at them. The COPD trial is in the New England Journal, and the asthma trial was published last week in The Lancet, which has done my CV a power of good. So just to sort of set the context, and I know that speakers earlier today have already kind of said this, but the whole clinical evaluation life cycle, I think we'd all agree, is way too long. And I've just put an artificial timeline there up to 15 years. Some people would say it's longer, some people shorter. But somewhere in the middle, you'll provide enough efficacy stuff to get marketing authorization. And that's either side of the line. Traditionally, it's been efficacy to the left and effectiveness studies to the right, with discovery clinical development for the regulatory purposes and the HTA organizations looking at the right-hand side of the line. So one of the things that was very interesting about the Salford lung study is they sit right across that bridge, if you like. So it was run as a late phase 3 trial with a pre-licensed medicine at the time, but it was actually an effectiveness study. And that's really helpful for all of us because that teaches us how we can use these kind of technologies to blur the initial phases of trial development, maybe from 2B onwards, but also how we can move them into later phase, what most people put into the real-world evidence scenario. So I think it's reasonable to say that if you were going to start to try and change the way clinical trials were done, you might not start in Salford. And a lot of people wouldn't know where it was. So it's actually in the northwest of England. It's a part of the Manchester area. So why the UK and why Salford? GSK could have done this anywhere. Well, we have the National Health Service. This is very good in terms of generalizability. So everybody's in it. It's free of the point of care. So the kind of results that you generate are likely to be generalizable, which is important for effectiveness work. A lot of people think that the NHS is one large organization where all the data are held in one place and you can just access it and it's just really straightforward. I have to say, I need to disillusion you on that one. It is not like that. It is just like the US. The data are extremely siloed. And one of the things you have to do to be able to do any of these kinds of studies is to bring that information together. And one of the huge advantages that we have on that score is a single unique identifier, which is the NHS number that allows us to do that. Our primary care doctors, our general practitioners, have been using electronic health records since the mid-90s. And it's a really good system with some really high-quality data in it. And we use that extensively in the lung studies. We have a national infrastructure that's been invested in by the government that helps us to perform these kind of studies. And why the Salford bit? Well, it's a 250,000-ish population. It's served by a single large university hospital that's got an enterprise-wide EHR. It's actually an all-script system. And we have been able to integrate the primary and secondary care data in this area since about 2002. And in fact, the Salford Hospital is regarded as the most digitally mature organisation in the NHS. So this is why, I guess, GSK decided to try and use us to do this. Perhaps more importantly than all of that, the technology is vitally important, but as Marie and I will say as we go through, it's not all about the technology, it's about the people. And we had a track record of close working between community and hospital care, and you have to have that. You cannot just deploy the technology and expect it to work. Of course, I have to do a quick advert for Northwest EHealth. That existed since 2008, and we were there to try and improve healthcare and research through using electronic health records. So what I've tried to say, I mean, this is a terminology that we've come up with, but I think it actually gives you a very good idea of what you need to do this kind of study, which is a connected community of care. That's got to pre-exist before you can really do these. I'm not going to dwell on the actual study, but it's just to give you an idea of the COPD design. You've probably seen this before. It's in the pack. Very open entry criteria at the left, much more so than in a standard COPD trial. And in fact, the investigators on this study estimate that around, if you take 100% of people that have COPD that might eventually get the drug, the numbers that would actually ever get into a COPD trial would be about 7%. So 93% are never exposed in the trial program. In asthma, it's been estimated it's worse than that. So it's only about 3% of patients would be eligible for a trial. And then the trial itself, you were randomized. I think we've talked about that already this morning. We believe that's a very important step for maintaining internal validity. And you only had 2 scheduled visits, one at the beginning and one 12 months later. Everything else was done behind the scenes by monitoring through the electronic health record system. So what did we do first? Well, actually, the first thing I did when GSK suggested they wanted to do this as a pre-licensed study was panic. Because nobody had ever done anything like that before and none of the technology existed. And both ourselves in the NHS and Northwest EHealth and GSK, we had to do this together as a partnership, right from the word go. None of us knew precisely how to do it. how could we best achieve internal-external validity? How could we do a feasibility for such a study? And this would be true of anything. So when we talk about scaling these studies and doing them elsewhere, you know, what data are there? What is it? What's in there? Can you actually get at them? And if you can get at the data, are they any good? Are they up to what you need them to be to do this kind of study? Once you've got the information, what are you going to do with it? How will you access it? How will you manage it? How will you validate the data flows in a way to satisfy the regulators? And indeed, not just the regulators. We've talked this morning about the payers and the research authorities. You've got to be able to tick all those boxes. And at the end of the day, did we have a large enough population in our area to power such a study? So we had to do what most people would call a real-world evidence study with GSK before we ever started. So we had to look at all of the COPD exacerbations, for example, for years before the study. We were able to do that because we had an integrated electronic health record system, and that allowed us to determine what numbers we needed and what the exacerbation rates were so we could power the study. So all of those are the things that you have to have in place, but that is only the tip of the iceberg. So I'm going to hand over to Marie for the next bit around operationalisation. And to keep the musical theme, we thought this was a bit like The Sound of Music. So it's climb every mountain, ford every stream, follow every byway. And we've done all of that.